Leviticus is the third book in the Bible, and it is a strange one. So much so that whenever someone sets out with a New Year's resolution to read the entire Bible, they often get to this third book, Leviticus, and decide to stop reading any further because they just can't seem to wrap their minds around such a perplexing book being in the Bible. And it is in this book that we find another passage that people often quote to condemn gay people. In fact, this tends to be the passage that religious protesters hold up on signs. It says the following: "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination." This one is hard to stomach. This passage has been hurled at gay people throughout the millennia to tell them that they are an abomination, which means that they as human beings evoke disgust or hatred from God and religious people. Does it really take much more critical thinking to deduce why many people, including gay people, turn their back on the Bible and perhaps God altogether when they come across passages like these ones? Passages like this seem to make us feel like we should toss out the whole text and perhaps even toss out baby Jesus along with the proverbial bathwater. And it is completely reasonable. Actually, I would say it's even completely commendable to turn one's back on a system that fuels condemnation and hatred. And for many people, Christian churches have been just that. On the other hand, if you're watching this video, then I imagine on some level you believe that Christian churches don't have to be that way. You believe that Christian churches can truly love and embrace everyone, but you just aren't quite sure what to do with passages like this one. So let's consider the context of the passage, shall we? First and foremost, Leviticus comes after the book of Exodus. This book, therefore, is part of a larger narrative at play here. In the book of Exodus, the Hebrew people are being oppressed in Egypt, where they are forced to work day and night as slaves. In the book of Exodus, it begins with the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, committing genocide against the Hebrew people to make sure there are not enough people for an uprising to ever occur. And this proceeds to tell the story of a Hebrew boy who survives the mass slaughter. That Hebrew boy's name is Moses. And as Moses grows up, the injustice that his people face angers him. He then is called to help free his people from slavery in Egypt. And through a series of miraculous events, the Hebrew people are freed. They are then left with the task of forming themselves into an independent nation after generations of people are being held in slavery. This is the context in which we get Leviticus. It contains a multitude of various types of rules. Some rules have to do with how to practice purity rituals for entering the temple. Some rules have to do with moral laws to govern your nation. And some rules are in place to intentionally set them apart from the other nations like Egypt. After all, as you can imagine, the Hebrew people naturally would have felt a visceral reaction to certain practices that reminded them of the people who oppressed them for so long. So there are scholars who think that many of the commands that seem kind of random to us, like, hey, don't eat shellfish, or don't make clothes out of mixed fabrics, those were practices that the empires of the day engaged in, like Egypt, that the Hebrew people intentionally did not want to practice. And the Hebrew word used to refer to these practices is tova, which I personally think is mistranslated into English as abomination. And I'm not alone in this, because the translators of the New International Version have been translating it for quite some time as detestable, which might seem like semantics that don't make much of a difference. But briefly consider the definitions of those English words. Abomination refers to something that evokes disgust or hatred, whereas detestable refers to something that invokes intense dislike. And with those differing definitions, the discussion shifts then from one of disgust or hatred to one of discomfort. And like I said, these practices that the Hebrew people called tova were practices that were common in the oppressive empires at the time. So you can imagine why the Hebrew people would have had a visceral reaction to them and decide that they were going to live differently. Now, while that might lighten the passage a little bit, it's still unsettling to us today. So what do we do with passages like this one and other strange texts in Leviticus today? The answer is that we do what rabbis have done with Leviticus for thousands of years. We interpret the lesser commandments in light of the greatest commandments. Rabbis often considered certain commands to be greater than others, meaning if you faced a dilemma where you had to choose between which commandments to follow, then you were to disregard the lesser commandments to follow the greater commandments. You see, while Leviticus contains some perplexing passages, to say the least, it also introduces beautiful passages into the world, like Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, which famously commands us to love our neighbors as ourselves. And for thousands of years, any rabbi would tell you that this commandment, to love your neighbor, along with Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, which says to love God, are the greatest commandments. So any good rabbi would tell you that if you face a dilemma where you have to choose between loving another human being or following another commandment in the Hebrew scriptures, then you are to disregard the command in order to choose loving your neighbor every time. And this is what I suggest doing today, because any command that causes us to treat people as detestable is not loving them. We are to disregard any lesser commands and choose loving our LGBTQ plus neighbors every time, because loving our neighbor is the greatest commandment.